I've
This
got a personal
conference
thing.
will now be recorded.
So, hi, Rob, Mark Fine. We met at a 10X meeting a long time ago. I can't remember where.
Yep.
Anyway, I'm interested in FDA guidance for reprocessing of endoscopes, and that's just a personal interest of mine. And Alan Cooper knows a lot about this, so maybe I'll just have a side conversation with him. But I'm interested in whatever you're interested in.
Okay. Well, reprocessing 510Ks are kind of interesting. When I first hired new employees, one of my new employees was Mary Votter, and she had the delightful task of working on 7 reprocessing 510Ks all at once.
What?
Yeah. The real killer is she not only got all the 510Ks, but she got them all in less than 70 days each.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty good first-time employee. But what we learned in the process was that when you go to file a 510K for a device that is reprocessed, even though there are codes for reprocessing, they don't want you to use those codes for some reason.
We lost you there for a second,
We
Rob.
lost audio.
Can you hear me now?
You're
Yes.
back.
Yeah.
Okay.
What happened there is that Joe Hage made Rob the organizer so Joe Hage could leave.
Got it.
Okay.
When I-
Thank you,
Hey,
Joe.
Joe.
If for any reason the call comes to a stop after I hang up, I'm sure one of you will tag me on Slack.
Okay.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
We're going to Piccadilly Circus or something, and everyone's mad at me.
At least you have me to blame.
Yes, I do. Goodbye.
Bye. So when you submit the 510K with for a reprocessed device, they only want you to use the exact same device that you're processing as the predicate. And they don't want you to use a reprocessing 3-letter classification code for some reason. So why they created those 3-letter codes, I have no idea. But they made it very clear we could only use the device that we're reprocessing as the predicate, and we had to make sure that we submitted it under that product code. And they want us to do all the exact same testing that was done for the predicate device. And so that actually created quite a bit of a challenge for some of the devices that are being reprocessed, because let's say you're making an endoscope and you've changed the endoscope over time, but some of those changes were letters to file and some were 510Ks. Then it's virtually impossible to figure out exactly what testing they did for the ones that were letters to file. And the older 510Ks, they don't even give you a lot of information about what testing was done in the 510K summaries. It's only in the last few years that they've started adding a lot more detail on the 510K summaries. So you actually end up with quite a challenge creating a reprocessing 510K, not because the testing challenges are so great, but just because you don't have a roadmap. You look at a 510K summary that doesn't have enough information. You have a device that might have the wrong, might not have all the details because it was a letter to file instead of an actual 510K. And it really creates a challenge. But I can tell you the number one thing we learned in that process was don't try to get a 510K for every single model and every single version that you could reprocess. Pick one that's very clear and get a 510K for that. And then do as much as you can with letters to file for the rest.
Well,
Because,
Rob,
yep, go ahead.
let me back up. So this is a new device, so it can't be a predicate to itself. So think of a transesophageal echo probe. You know, it's basically a gastroscope with an ultrasound transducer at the end. There are no channels on it. There's no elevators, all the things that get endoscopes into trouble. So we're making an endoscope that is very much like a transesophageal scope. It's just the transducer without a channel, without elevators. So it's a new device. No one's ever done this before. But so what do we do? Because we don't have a predicate.
If you're trying to get it 510K cleared, you have a choice between deciding whether it's reusable or not. If you
Yes.
decide it's reusable, then you're going to do all the cleaning validation to show that it can be reprocessed.
And how burdensome would that be?
There's actually a guidance for it, and it's not all that hard.
Okay.
You show that when you clean it, you basically use artificial soils that they have a standard for, and then you look for markers in the soils, and they're usually looking for 2 markers. Usually it's if it's going to be in contact with blood, usually it's protein and hemoglobin, and I think the others are protein and carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So those are usually the 2 combinations, but I'm definitely not the expert in doing cleaning validations. So you contact a lab like Nelson Labs or NAMSA or WUXI AppTech, and you ask them to help you with a quote for reprocessing or cleaning validation of the device. And they're going to use artificial soils, and they're going to use the standard, and it's going to be done to that standard with that acceptance criteria. So it's actually not all that hard. You just need to, usually the challenge is having enough devices to do the validation, because they want you to have used devices. And of course, you only have brand new prototypes, so you actually have to wash them multiple times to simulate use.
Is it kind of
So people put it in a cleaner and they'll wash it, and they'll put it in the cleaner and wash it, and keep on doing that over and over.
So is it kind of the typical, you do a human factors study with 25 people who in the hospital would be doing the, in the central supply service, those are the people who clean surgical instruments and stuff, and you get 25 people to go through it?
I haven't seen anybody do usability studies for the cleaning validation. I've seen it been done by the labs, and they do it according to your work instructions. So you provide work instructions on how to clean it, and they perform the cleaning exactly the way you tell them to, and then they record the number of cycles, and then they do this testing to show that the 2 markers have been removed, so they can't detect above a certain level of those 2 markers.
I don't know if you heard, but when Pentax, they had a endoscope, an EUS endoscopic ultrasound system. I heard they spent $1 million getting through that process. There were a few deaths, and people got really sick because they couldn't clean with their duodenus.
Yeah, there are definitely some devices out there that are nearly impossible to clean. So that's one of the key things to do, is to talk with both the lab and talk with reprocessors about what things to avoid in your design to make it easier to clean.
Excuse me, I gotta get rid of my dog here.
Hey, Rob,
Hey.
Yep.
you mentioned the standard. Is that an external standard or is that an FDA standard?
I think there's both. I think there's both an FDA guidance document on it that I can send an email out for in Slack, or send a message out in Slack with a link. So I'll do that later on this afternoon. It won't be right after the meeting, but it'll be this afternoon, probably like 2:30. And then I think there's also an ISO standard that's referenced in that guidance.
Okay, thanks.
It's either ISO or I think there's AMI standard on reprocessing.
Okay.
cleaning
Yeah,
process.
I know there's an AMI one, but most of the AMI standards are also ISO standards.
So I'm curious, Rob, what's the difference between a standard orthopedic instrument that's, reused thousands of times versus something that's getting reprocessing? Is that because you're having somebody different than the manufacturer doing the reprocessing?
Well, when we talk about somebody submitting a 510K for reprocessed devices, what we really mean is we're submitting a 510K for reprocessing a device that was indicated for single use only.
Okay.
Okay. And so those are the tough ones. But when you have an orthopedic instrument that is designed for reuse,
Right.
like a scalpel or a rongeur or anything like that, usually those devices are made out of a single piece of metal that is designed for cleaning, and it's fairly rugged. And it's the devices that are made of plastic and have working channels that are nightmares. And so when you start talking about endoscopes with working channels, most people just wash their hands and walk away.
Right.
it's not that you can't, it's just that demonstrating and validating it are a serious challenge unless you really design it for cleanability.
Well, an ERCP scope costs like $50,000, so it's obviously not a use once and throw it away. So it's, I guess I was using the wrong term. It's not reprocessed. It's reuse or multi-use.
Yeah,
So,
and reuse and multi-use, it's the cleaning validation of that that's very hard. But there's really not a lot of difference between reprocessing simple devices and reuse of a more complex device. They're just being cleaned, and you have to verify the cleaning works. But the reprocessing industry of single-use devices sometimes gets really complicated because they'll actually take components off the device and replace them. So they might have, let's say, some sort of, I'm trying to remember what the word is, a strain relief or something on the part that's made out of plastic or rubber that just doesn't last. And so they'll cut that off or peel that off and put on a new one.
Mhm.
So they'll have components that just don't last, don't make it through, and they'll take those off. I'm actually working with a client right now where we're purposely designing the device from day one to be reprocessed, even though normally it's a single-use device. And we were contemplating 3 different designs. One, make it a completely hermetically sealed device, so no liquid ingress could be on the inside of the device where there are electronics. Another concept we had was encasing part of it, so if some did get in, at least the electronics wouldn't get touched. And then a third scenario we had was make it so it can be disassembled and cleaned on the inside. So lots of strategies, and you know, it's the kind of project that Rick Stockton is a real good person to know. He'll come up with some neat mechanical ideas for how to take it apart and put it back together, and you know, let's change this component so it's easier to remove. So you're not only talking about design for manufacturability, but you're talking about design for reprocessing, and that's something nobody's doing right now. But we just had a design meeting with a client of ours yesterday where we said, hey, let's think about making this design for reprocessing, because it was a $400 device with certain components that you replace, but other components they were just going to throw out. And I said, why don't we make it designed so you mark it each time it's reused, and after 3 marks you toss it out, and that cuts the cost by 75%. And that's a big impact on something that's a $400 product. You know, you're going to take your net cost and drop it down to, you know, basically half. Even with the parts that have to be replaced, you're still probably about half the cost just by making it reprocessed 3 times.
But Rob, for example, we happen to be working on a project right now for an intubator, and there's a part which is the metal part is for reuse, but there's a part which is used that time and then tossed. You don't have to go through the cleaning of the tossed part. You just have to.
No.
Okay.
If there's a component that's designed to be disposed, you clearly indicate that's supposed to be disposed. But there are people out there who will take those disposable parts and try to reprocess them.
But is that our response?
No, it's not your responsibility. If somebody wants to do that, they have to get their own 510K. Even if it's a hospital, the hospital has to file a 510K.
Got it.
So
Okay,
that's a whole new industry out there. Well, I won't say new. It's probably about 10 years old now, at least. But the companies that are reprocessed, they work for the hospitals, and they will go out and they will retrieve the instruments. They'll clean them, take them apart, put them back together, make sure they work, sterilize them, and they reprocess things that were not intended to be reprocessed. But the better ones do a really good job of making sure that it can be reliably reprocessed and safely reprocessed. And in Europe, to bring up our favorite European regulations, they've actually they debated for a really long time about how they were going to handle reprocessing. Because certain countries, like the northern countries, Finland, Sweden, they're not allowing reprocessing, period. There's too much risk there. And the southern countries are requiring it for economic reasons. So the middle countries negotiated it. And what they came up with is all devices what they'll do is they'll come up with a common specification document that lists which types of devices may be reprocessed and which types of devices may not be under any circumstances due to safety reasons. And then for the ones that are allowed to be reprocessed, they can only be reprocessed if it's allowed in the member state where it's being reprocessed. So if you're in one of those northern countries, even though it's on the list to be reprocessed, they won't allow it, so it's against the law. And in the countries where it is allowed, you can do it, but you have to validate it. And they have special quality system requirements and technical file requirements for those reprocessors. So they did a pretty good job of sort of carving out a path to make everybody less unhappy. But the common specification document, I don't believe, is available yet, just like everything else. So we'll see it sometime later this year or early next. Any other questions about reprocessing?
Are there any specific companies that you're aware of that are doing a very good job at this?
One of our clients, Provision DRS out in Oregon, Bend, Oregon, is excellent. And we know that they, not only are they doing a really good job, but they're attracting a lot of attention from bigger partners that are asking them to do the reprocessing for them.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So Rick, so I'm sorry, Rob. So getting back to the, just happened to be thinking about the project that we're on. So if our instructions, if our IFU and 510K says that this injection molded part must be disposed of after each use.
Yep.
So you're saying that then, so we would be labeled properly, but then if somebody then decides to reuse it, then it's just completely separate labeling then from our labeling.
Exactly. And so what you would do in your device description that you submit to the FDA, you're going to have a table listing the various components, and you're going to say what components are reusable and what components are disposable. And all you have to do is provide cleaning validation for the reusable components.
Okay.
The disposable, you don't worry about. Then if somebody else decides to deviate from that, they have to do their own 510K and prove it. And they usually are expected, or not usually, they are expected by law to remove your label and put on their own label.
That's what I was just getting at. I was just thinking of the fact that does it come back to us at some point if there's a problem at that end?
They're supposed to identify it with the UDI. They're supposed to have their own label on it.
Okay.
Oftentimes the companies will also, they won't completely obliterate the logo and things that are on there from your product, because you still need to know it's compatible with all the instruments and hardware that yours is compatible with. But they have to make it very clear on the label that it comes packaged in, and on that UDI that it's their product and what lot and what it was reprocessed in. They have to have clear markings for how many times it's been reprocessed. And the FDA targets those companies that are reprocessors for priority inspections. So 6 months after they get a 510K, the FDA is in their door.
Got it.
Yeah,
I have heard of companies actually trying to fix their single-use devices so the reprocessors can't reprocess them, but they tend to be able to get around that somewhere along the line.
Oh yeah, it's like patent law.
Yeah.
We'll fix it so they can't get around it, and then a week later somebody's got a loophole.
Yep. Yeah, Stryker down in Florida does a lot of reprocessing of single-use items.
Yes, they do, and they have a whole division just for that.
Yep.
Yeah, and they're not the only ones. All the big players, just to negotiate with the hospitals. The hospitals say, well, we're not going to pay this much. We can reprocess this. Please help us. And in order to keep those big hospitals doing business with them, that's what they do.
Good info.
So it
Okay.
also includes packaging validations, which is how I happen to know about Stryker. But
The
they have to
packaging
redo all
validation,
those.
yeah, they don't have to use the exact same packaging. So
Right.
yeah, so your expertise definitely would come in handy for anybody that's sort of reverse engineering the packaging design and doesn't know all the secrets that Stryker might have known when they designed the original equipment. But I think that companies that are brand new companies that are starting out, one of the great differentiators for your product can be design it from day one so it can be reprocessed. If you do that, you're going to be at a cost advantage to companies that have specifically designed it so it can't be reprocessed. So they spend all this work trying to get around reprocessing, but if they actually intentionally design it so it can be easily reprocessed and had proper instructions for it, that would make it a total lower cost than the products that are designed for throwing them out. Even though they might be more expensive up front, the total cost is usually what the hospitals are negotiating on, because oftentimes they're paying per use.
But in that case, then you would have to validate the cleaning.
Exactly. But if you think about it, if I design something from day one so it can be reprocessed, I might select different materials and different design features right from the start. And that's something companies aren't doing right now, but I think it's a small sort of avenue for small companies to work on to get an edge on the bigger companies, because the bigger companies are taking the opposite extreme. I think Stryker's seeing the opportunities there, but I think for the most part, most of the big companies are saying we're going to make this disposable and try to prevent people from reprocessing.
Well, and don't
Yeah, you could actually even take that a little bit further and design it to be reprocessed, but also figure out how to do the reprocessing yourself. That way, you're getting that additional revenue, and it's going to make it easier from a 510K standpoint because you know all the testing and everything that was done for the original submission because you did it.
Yep.
That's true, and if you're a big enough company, I think that makes sense. Or if you have the capacity and capital to do it, that makes sense. But just like contract sterilization, we don't buy our own gamma radiators and we don't buy our own EO chambers for the most part. We can, but unless you have the operations that are large enough, you're probably not going to want to build your own reprocessing facility. If you ask somebody that's doing reprocessing, you'll get a better appreciation for how hard it is to manage, because 1 week you've got a ton of material from the hospital that they want turned around yesterday, and then for the next month you have nothing. So they'll hang on to a lot of product for a long time, and then when they ship it back to you, they want it turned around immediately. And it's because it's coming. It doesn't make sense for them to ship 1 or 2 units at a time. So they want to ship in bulk, and so they ship you a bunch of used product to you in bulk, and then they want it turned around right away. And that's not really an efficient way to do things. And so what makes sense is a hospital taking a whole host of products, maybe 20 or 30 different types of products, and sending it back to a reprocessor that handles all of them. And some are going to be your products and some are going to be somebody else's products. And it's just more efficient from a logistics standpoint to handle it that way. But you're right, if you get the volume and you've made it easy enough to reprocess, it's extra money for you. But I think there's a bigger opportunity, at least more realistic and practical opportunity, to share the revenues with a partner that specializes in reprocessing and make a deal with them.
Yeah.
And they're going to show you all the pitfalls of reprocessing. I'm sorry, I talked over you. What did you say?
No, my apologies. So how does that play out as from a pricing standpoint? You know, in the consumer markets, subscription models are very big, from Netflix to you name it. How does that play out whether you're partnered up with a refurbishing or a reprocessing company versus the one sell and then letting the hospital or some other type of partnership get the income from that reprocessing?
There's just taking endoscopes and laparoscopes and devices like that. For a long time, there's been pricing models where they pay per use. So I think that's most of the time that's how you're going to see the pricing that the hospital negotiates. It's going to be pay per use because that's how the capitation codes are set up. And I don't think there's any need to deviate from that or create a new model. I think they understand it, they like it, they know how much they're going to get from their insurance providers, and all they want to know is that they're paying less per unit, so there's a little profit for them. And then you negotiate directly with the reprocessor to figure out what the recycling cost is. If it's a hospital that's sending it off to a reprocessor, I don't know how that's going to play out. It's going to make things a little bit more complicated for them. So they're going to assume they're going to get 3 uses out of units, but every once in a while you have a unit that got trashed pretty hard and it's not going to be able to be reprocessed, so they're going to have to toss it. And so you have some shrinkage.
They prefer the single price, and you
from a
worry
negotiation, yeah, that's what they prefer, is a per use. And so it makes for a more complicated negotiation if you start having to worry about how many units are reprocessed, how many times are they reprocessed, how many are going to get damaged en route and not be reusable. It's complicated. But that's the world
at
of
the end of the day, it's the trick is to understand the use behavior in the hospital, and then just a deep understanding of the product and its ability to be refurbished.
Yes, and I think the UDI codes are going to help, because now with the UDI codes we can track this percentage of units made it 1 time, this percent made 2 times, this made 3 times. That will be very helpful. But
Yeah,
the fact that not all devices are required to be labeled on the device, and some companies aren't compliant, is creating problems. And there's a very large volume of class 1 devices that are reprocessed.
Okay, thank you.
The only thing, Rob, I have to tell you, just thinking back, I can't think of one of our clients that have come to us and said, make this reusable. Everybody says, figure out a disposable or figure out a consumable, because that's what everybody's mind is on.
Yeah, that razor blade model is one that people think it's not broken, so don't fix it. But if you look at your insurance premiums, you might think there's an opportunity.
Yeah, the business trend is definitely on, I mean, at least in the consumer sector, is definitely on the reused, reprocessing, refurbished.
Yeah.
And it's a segment. There's definitely a segment, a large segment for the disposable, but I definitely think that there's room to play out. And like you said, if you design it from the get-go and you can understand, you know, right from the beginning that this is designable for that price segmentation, it's quite interesting.
And they're more obscure laws and regulations and standards than most medical device standards. So the people that really take their time to learn it can make some money and carve out a nice niche for themselves. It's just like regulatory affairs. Nobody likes it. It's 2,000 to 6,000 pages of documentation for a 510K, and who wants to do that? They'd love to outsource it. So, and the regulations will never get easier. They'll always get harder. So I have permanent employment for as long as I want it. People will never love doing regulatory filings. So it's a niche. I think there's a niche out there for people that want to take devices that cost way too much and are not being, that are single use only, and thinking about which ones of these products would be good candidates for reprocessing. And let's come out with a new version that's user friendly for reprocessing, and come up with a nice pricing model that's per use, and make a deal with the hospitals, and they can carve out a niche pretty quick.
Is there a difference in your mind between reprocessing and refurbishing?
Yes, the reprocessing is usually the cleaning of it, and the refurbishing is it's worn. So a lot of times what we're seeing on The refurbishing is there's a tip that's worn and it has to be sharpened or just replaced, and the new tip is sharp. And we see a lot of that. Endoscopes, we've seen refurbishing of endoscopes where they take all the lenses out and they put in new lenses, or they glue them in again. That's very hard technical work to do. It's definitely, there's definitely a refurbishing market out there. But it is slightly different.
Okay.
Yeah, and the FDA actually treats it differently from a regulatory standpoint too.
Gotcha. Do you know of any companies that break out their reporting from a business standpoint where they show those metrics? Where they're like kind of proud in a way to tout that they've got this much production segmentation, you know, new sales and this much secondary market sales, or refurbishment or reprocessing sales.
I think the bigger players like Strikers have a whole separate division. That's what they do.
Okay.
I actually had somebody from Stryker contact me that they were responsible for that division. So I think that's how they're doing it at the large companies. And I don't know if they're reporting that publicly.
Mm-hmm.
I know internally, you know, here's how this business unit's doing, and this is how this business unit's doing. But I don't think there's a whole lot of sizzle when you're talking to investors in Wall Street about, hey, look how great our reprocessing unit's doing.
Well, no, they usually look at it as, hey, look how great our secondary market is doing. We take all this product, move it to India or to some other place, and we've created a new life for a whole series of products.
Yeah, and I haven't gotten too involved in the refurbishing market where you try to refurbish it and then sell it in other markets. A lot of people refer to that as sort of a gray market, but it's large. There's a lot of money there. But I haven't seen a lot of companies focusing on that as their business model, and I haven't seen too many companies reporting it. Usually the focus is always on what's new.
Sure.
And it's certainly not new, but it's not something to scoff at, because there's not a few 100,000, there's a few 100 million.
Right. No, it's interesting. Yeah.
I haven't heard from Rick. Is he still on the phone?
He is. I thought,
I
was just kind of, well, as you were going through this, I was thinking of customers that have asked for that same kind of thing. And if you wanted to report, if you wanted to somehow make your efforts to reprocess more public and more publicly accessible, they'd probably be expressed in words like sustainability. They'd probably be, and there are probably a couple of different good words for the amount of waste or throwaway that comes out of every product, aside from packaging itself. And I've also seen times where they'd like to have something that could be replaced or refurbished, but that takes a little bit more design time. And I've run into a lot of examples of, we just need to take some cost out so that we have some more flexibility. We can decide which we want to do. And sometimes you can end up having a lot of design effort going into a change that is successful, but you can't tell with the naked eye what was changed. So those are the kind of things that were running through the back of my mind when you're talking.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's tons to do. There's tons to do.
Yeah, I see everything getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and using sensors that communicate remotely with hardware. And I think that's taking down some of the costs and making the landfills smaller. But it's definitely a trend that we should see more of.
and more things that can also be managed by the patient or managed as locally as possible. Every time someone comes up with a system and they say, yeah, we can get this all to work, and we've got this huge RF network, and we've got this huge thing which will manage it all together. I was working with somebody, for Pete's sake, who had, they were making cattle ear tags to measure the temperature of cattle and be able to identify the sick ones before they infected the rest of the herd. And I was just doing the housing for him. He'd already figured out the algorithms and the electronics and everything like this, way more complicated than I thought it was. And there's no network at all. It's just an LED that you can see from a mile away that starts flashing, and you see a couple of little lights start blinking in the middle of your herd. This guy would have his neighbors calling in and saying, hey, you know, I see a couple of lights out there. You know, people retired, they got nothing else to do, they're just kind of hanging out on the hillside. Hey, you know, but things that are manageable by smaller networks that are less vulnerable to problems and are more independently controlled, more locally worn or controlled. Those are some real exciting things. We're not gonna be able to take care of medical health care by generating billions of dollars to be able to just give away to folks. We've got to make it more controllable by the individual. We've got to give them more choices and more visibility to what's going on, and we have to make things more locally, more wearable, less giant system. And those are the kind of things. It's easier to innovate something that's small because you don't also have to change the giant system within which it all works. So from a regulatory point of view, you can only appreciate that. But those are the kind of things that I see people talking to me about. Things where they don't have to change everything to make their new innovation work. Yeah. So it's kind of cool.
You had talked about a little bit about sustainability, or mentioned that when I was reading through the new risk management guidance document. It's 24971, and it was just released last week. I realized that there is a new standard out, or I don't know how new it is, but there's a standard for reliability, and it also gets into statistics for determining reliability. So that might be useful for somebody that's in that field as well. Is how do we validate this, and how do we make sure it's going to last the number of uses that we want? They actually have standards for it. And so a lot of companies come up with these arbitrary numbers, but there's actually a standard out there that tells you this is how to determine how many cycles it's going to last.
And sometimes just staying out of an entire statistical range, for instance, on an FMEA, I've done FMEAs where that turned out to be their guidance for what to address and what to ignore.
Yeah.
So they're not all wallpaper window dressing. Some of them we've actually used for analytical work to help develop a product, or while transferring a product from one company to another, giving it a systematic overview and getting everything up to date. I did that with an automotive company not long ago. Automotive and medical, their systems in many ways are so similar. But when I transitioned to medical 25 years ago, it was like almost no difference at that time.
Yeah. And I think the medical has changed, but the automotive seems to have stronger systems. When I learned FMEAs at an automotive company, they were so much more sophisticated than a medical device company is in doing an FMEA.
They were,
but
the medical ones.
But now the medical device industry.
I would say foods was a lot more sophisticated than medical devices too. When I've done FMEAs and foods, medical devices are really behind on a lot of stuff.
Yeah, but they have lots of standards. So instead of just one standard, they've got 6 that they're using. That they added a new one in this new guidance, an ETA. So yet another risk management tool, but I'd be really happy if people would use the tools that they got well. But instead I go in and I'm like, we'll just throw this out and start over again.
Sometimes I feel like if I'm doing a medical FMEA and I cut my teeth on automotive FMEAs, when I'm doing a medical one, I feel like I'm finger painting as opposed to drafting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little more crude. And they've separated some of the useful tools that you need. So it's kind of strange. I expected them to move all the tools from the risk management standard over to the guidance. They moved most of them, but they didn't move all of them. So there's still some tools left in the standard. So now you need to buy both.
Yeah, I think ISO is trying to make more money. So they're doing
Really?
that. I'm on some ISO committees. I think they're trying to do that more and more. I even have trouble trying to get things when I'm supposed to be helping to write them.
Yeah, they're definitely being a little bit more aggressive about trying to make money off of it. But I think this change that they went through was a big improvement over what there was. So I don't mind paying the money for it, but
yeah,
I still find clients that like $20 for this is way too much money, and yet they'll have 5 people sitting around a conference table debating on whether they could buy it. And I'm like, well, you just spent that money just discussing it.
Yeah, that's why I try to get people in the ASTM, $75, and you can download all those standards that cost $45 and $35 for free in your field.
Yeah, and I went ahead and I bought a gold membership for AMI for my employees too, and myself, so we could download the standards. And I think I've paid for the membership like 10 times over already in just the last 6 months.
Well, if you get involved on some of the AMI and the ISO standards, it's a interesting, and they're trying to get some SMEs in there that actually can speak logically and write a whole sentence without being a run-on. And unfortunately, you got to say it 3 or 4 different ways because of the way the Europeans read English. But it's they're really dying for people.
I know. I can't bring myself to sit on a committee and argue over the wording of a sentence. I think it literally might kill me.
That's when you become a task leader. That's what I did. I took over a task, and then I just told them this is what we're doing, and they could argue a little bit, but they can come up with a better one. So they stopped arguing.
Oh.
Just need some strong people in there. It just depends upon what you're working on too.
Yeah.
Finally, a use for exhaustion.
Excuse me?
Yeah, I'm afraid my opinions are very strong, and I'm very practical, and I think those go against the grain of standards.
No, they want more people like you. Definitely.
I know they say they do, but do they really?
Yes, they do. I'm on committees. Yes, we do.
Well, I've been doing some writing of coursework for AMI, so Mary and I have been doing a lot of that, and so I'll get more involved, I'm sure, at some point. But for right now, I'm sort of sitting from the sidelines and watching.
Yeah, I know when they were doing the human factors standard, I got to put some inputs in there, even though I wasn't on the team, and that really helped in my field because they forgot to mention packaging. So a lot of people say if it's not mentioned, you don't have to do it.
Of course not. They forgot it in the standard, so it doesn't exist.
Yeah, I went to a conference. I was at the MDM this week, and there was a big session on cleaning, and they were talking about those things you were talking about that go up and check you out for colonoscopies. And she was showing on cleaning, they're supposed to be recleanable things, but they had 7 different surfaces that all required different materials to actually clean them properly. And some of them would hurt the other ones. And these are microscopic tight, well, very small pieces in the tip. So that's a really poor design.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of things are not designed for cleanability. It's sort of an afterthought. And you know, from packaging, a lot of things are, packaging is an afterthought.
Yes.
Packaging, sterilization, and cleanability, all afterthoughts.
Which is ridiculous. I mean, my big thing is, how do you ship it somewhere, and then you go figure that out, and then you start designing the product to fit in that space.
Yeah.
That way you
Yeah,
save a lot of money.
a good product manager is thinking from the use all the way back, and so therefore packaging, reusability, and all those things actually should come, early in the process.
Yeah, it should.
So how does the industry push in that direction and be less engineer kind of front, conceptualization front versus kind of usability first?
I am not sure.
I got quite an education when we were doing a webinar with Research Collective in Arizona, and they were showing when you do the usability testing during the development phase. And what I see a lot of people doing is usability testing only as summative testing during verification and validation. And to see companies doing it more in the development stage when they're working out different prototypes, that was quite interesting. So I revised our design plan template to include usability in the development phase as well as at the verification validation stage. So we actually have multiple places in our design plan template where usability is expected. And I think just that simple reminder, it doesn't take more than a few minutes to say, oh yeah, we should start thinking about usability now instead of waiting till the end.
Nice.
And little tweaks like that can make a big difference. Same thing on risk. Risk, you don't create a risk management file at the very end. You create it at the beginning. You create your risk management plan when you create your design plan. You start identifying your hazards before you've even started development. And same things have to happen for packaging. You need to start thinking right from the start, what kind of packaging do we need for this product? How is it going to be shipped? And I can't tell you how many clients I've seen. I'll give a real good example. I had a client that planned on using a specific sterilizer for their contract sterilization. And they didn't look at any of the details of the packaging or the sterilization until the very end. Ooh. So they asked a contract design house to develop the product for them. And they said, oh, let's save some money and let's just reuse the exact same packaging that you used for your last catheter. Well, that was a straight box, and they kept the catheter straight. And because their catheter was a little bit longer than the norm, it was so long it didn't even fit on a pallet unless you stacked it vertically. And if you stacked it vertically, it was over 48 inches long, so it was over 48 inches high on your pallet, so it wouldn't fit in a normal chamber for sterilization. So they had to go into a 2-pallet chamber to sterilize 20 units.
Yeah, I had that with some skunk works. They came in with a 68-inch long catheter, and I said, how are you sterilizing this? And they said, ETO. And I said, you don't have it set so I can put it up in the air. And they went, no, flat. I said, no, 48-inch pallet. That's all you get. And
Yep. And I had another company say, well, we want to do this in an EO bag. And I'm like, there's no bag that big.
They have them now. They have some.
Not something over 48 inches long, do they?
Oh, well, no, yeah. It doesn't quite fit in the chamber. That new flexible ETO thing. I don't think it's quite that big. Right.
Yeah. The Anderson Scientific has had some nice large bags that you can use, but they're not that big.
Yeah. I say I don't know, because I go out and do consulting and try and get processes set up to do the formative studies in the beginning, to make sure you get your risk assessments set up and done. But I see them say, a hole in the bag, and they think that only happens when they ship it. Well, that isn't the only place you can get holes. So
Yeah.
that's why you need it in the beginning, and you need to detail it out. I have a lot of trouble getting people to understand a hole in a bag can happen in a lot of different places, and they have a lot of different ways of preventing it. And you can't just say it's shipping. So I don't know how to get more companies to look at it. I just know that when I go out there and I talk about it and I do that stuff, I try and make them think about it. And formative studies for that for the HF, human factors, is really important to do.
Yeah.
And not
I
just for the
agree.
device, for the package too. It's a requirement now with the standards, so they can
So
actually open it,
absolutely. And
get it
one of
out.
the interesting things that was in that webinar that we did, they were also talking about the cleaning. So we spent a lot of time talking about reprocessing. Well, even if you give somebody a device that say it's reusable and you give them validated work instructions, who's to say they're actually going to follow them correctly? So one of the speakers on the call here today was saying, do you have to do usability testing for the cleaning validation? I haven't seen anybody do that, but the human factors company that we had do a webinar was specifically mentioning that. And so I suspect there are definitely some products out there that when they've done an investigation of a complaint or an adverse event, they've discovered, oops, people can't really do it the way we've intended. Or there's way too many use errors when people try to clean this the way we describe. Just yesterday when we had a design review meeting with a client, they were talking about how to explain what they're doing to clients or to customers that are going to be using their device. They do an in-service at a hospital and say, this is how to use our device. And they said they're actually doing time studies to make sure people are able to do it fast enough. And they actually were starting to game it. So see which team can do this fastest, which really drove home the training and made it more fun, and people really got engaged. But one of the things I said to them was, you really ought to take videos of these, because even though you're doing the training really well, not everybody's going to be able to sit through those sessions. So if you can videotape it, then you're going to have a lot of great material showing use errors as well as the right way to do things. And you don't always have to have the video with sound. You can edit the videos and show graphics over the top of it. So this is step one, put a number 1 on the screen and watch somebody doing step 1. And then you can have a smiley face that's green and a red frown face to show correct way and the incorrect way. And so those are great ways, without having to do any translations, to explain to people step by step how to do the cleaning of a product, or how to box it, or how to unbox it. If we can break a flat screen TV, we can certainly break every other delicate piece of medical device equipment too, just unboxing it.
That's interesting that you brought up that usability isn't considered in the reprocessing side of medical device, because what me and Mark were talking about as far as like endoscope technology for the two somewhat similar projects that we were kind of talking about was I know the GI that we were talking to, he isn't able to afford one of the larger reprocessing machines for endoscopes, so he does it by hand with a lot of brushes. The process is like hundreds of steps, and so like it's extremely dependent on the person that he hires to do the cleaning. And to go with that, I remember the head nurse says that she's let several people go because they're not detail oriented enough to go through this, the steps thoroughly enough to where they feel comfortable with their reprocessing. So yeah, I find it interesting that that's not a thing that's considered currently in the reprocessing steps for devices, because it definitely seems like an area where a lot of errors could happen.
Yeah, when I was in operations management and I was training inspectors, I would look specifically for the detail-oriented people to put them in inspection roles. And then eventually we went to, we're going to do it by the numbers, and trained everybody. You do it in the following sequence: 1, 2, 3, 4. And if you had something that was more than like 20 steps, good luck. You really need to break it down into smaller steps and have it be sequential and always be the same sequence. But trying to hire people that are detail oriented is kind of hard, and it's getting harder with this generation of younger people that are a little bit ADD in everything.
Yeah, Atul Gawande wrote this book called The Checklist Manifesto, which I've got to recommend to everybody. He's a surgeon, and he just talked about, even people who don't think they need checklists need checklists. So.
Oh yeah.
What is it called?
Yeah, my own business works better when I boil it down to a checklist.
It's called Checklist Manifesto. Atul Gawande. He's a neuro or a cardiac surgeon. He's written a lot of popular medical kind of books. He's really great.
If you could put a link in our Slack channel, that would be great.
I will look for it.
Okay, and I'll put a link there for the FDA guidance, and if I can find the ISO as well.
Thanks.
I think this is probably a good time to stop. We're at 12:10. Anybody have a last minute question before we go?
Nope.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Nope, I got one. When you put
Okay.
could you put the reference for the 24971 in there too? I wanted
Sure.
to take a look at it.
So where should we put this? So which of the topics?
I would put it right below the comment that Rick had there, or what are we covering today?
Okay, got it. I'll
yeah,
put it
on the call for today.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
See y'all.
thank you.